Welcome back to Close Up. There had been some talk that the U.S. Senate field on the Republican side was not set just yet. And this last week we gained not just another candidate in that race, but a real wild card in the form of Bruce Fenton, a Seacoast investor and a leader in the world of cryptocurrency. Well, he's not exactly your garden variety Republican. He does have the ability to self-fund his campaign, giving him unique potential in a wide open race among candidates who are largely unknown. Mr. Fenton is our guest this morning on Close Up. Thanks for joining us, Bruce.
Thanks a lot for having me, Adam.
So tell us a little bit about who you are and why you're running for U.S. Senate.
Well, I'm a husband and a father and a business owner, an entrepreneur. I'm a Bitcoiner, as you mentioned, and I'm somebody who believes that our country is in trouble and that our world is going through very, very significant changes. And the reason I'm running is because we need to have a country that embraces our core values, constitutional values that we have of freedom and liberty and human rights. And I just haven't seen that in recent years, and we haven't seen that in Washington, particularly in the last 2 years. So I think that the free state, New Hampshire, should send somebody to Washington who shares those values.
Let's have you expound a little bit on those core principles and the kind of policies you'd be advocating for if you're in the Senate in Washington.
Yeah, I'm completely for human freedom and human choice. I'm totally against the kind of tyranny that we've seen over the last 2 years with mandated lockdowns and movement passes and mandated masks and things like that. Those actions have no place in a free society, and they're completely unworkable. The idea that we can have politicians who call themselves scientists decide when someone can open their business or when they can work or where they can move, or that you need a government movement pass to carry around to tell you where you can go, is just completely unworkable in a free society. It's not what the founders envisioned, and it's not something that works here, and we have to stop it.
So what would have been what would have been an appropriate government response then to COVID-19 in your view?
Nothing. The government doesn't need to be involved in the personal affairs of individuals. The government, decisions should be made based on everybody's individual risk profile and what risks they're choosing to take. Government can inform people, but as far as actions, we've seen it was a complete disaster. Centralized planning doesn't work. That's the kind of thing that you see in communist China. The idea that somebody in Washington, D.C. can decide what people in Exeter or any other town in New Hampshire should do with their lives, or what risks that are, that they should be able to take, is just nothing to do with the America that I know.
So you've got these core libertarian principles. Why did you decide to run in the GOP primary rather than an independent run for Senate?
Well, to win, you need to be with one of the main parties with the way that the system is. And there's a very strong Liberty Republican contingent here in New Hampshire, and it's growing nationwide. A lot of Republicans, and by the way, even Democrats, there's a lot of Democrats that are moving more towards liberty because they're not happy to see the censorship and the reckless economic policies and the other things that are going on with their party. So there's a strong liberty movement within the Republican Party, both at a federal level and in many states, and certainly here in New Hampshire more than anywhere else. So it's a natural fit.
Do you think you'll be able to toe the party line in Washington, though? That's so much of what the U.S. Senate is now, where it's kind of just like Team A, Team B, and you have to have, if it's 50 or 51 votes, everybody's kind of got to be on that same team. So that doesn't seem like something you would like or enjoy.
No, I wouldn't toe a party line or you'd be on a team. I would represent the voters of New Hampshire, and if they choose to put me in that office, I'm going to do exactly what I tell them I'm going to do, which is vote consistently for as little intervention as possible. There's not too much power that a senator has, but they can vote and they can put bills forth, and sometimes they can influence others. That's really all you can do, and that's what I would do.
Do you plan to seek the endorsement of former President Trump in this race?
I'm not going to be seeking endorsements and doing a lot of the typical kinds of things. I would certainly welcome his endorsement. I'd welcome the endorsement of anyone. But I'm going to spend the effort, the time that I have, I'm going to spend that talking to as many voters as I can and getting my message out and having people get to know me and get to understand what I stand for. And if they believe that I'm a candidate that would represent them well, then they can vote for me.
Big dividing line for Republicans right now is perspective on what happened in the 2020 election. Do you agree with President Trump that this was, quote unquote, stolen from him in some way?
Well, we We don't know because we weren't able to get accurate information about that. The hearing that was going on was stopped, and most of the media declared, various theories to be misinformation. President Trump himself was banned from social media and, basically excommunicated from mainstream media. So we don't know. As Americans, we don't know. And I would question anybody who says that they know for sure. Certainly based on mainstream news, we don't really know what would happen. I think that there's certainly a lot of very suspicious things about this election, and those should be looked at. And the credibility of the election is under threat, really. It's something that just the fact we have these big questions and these anomalies. And there's been a lot of work, a good friend of mine, Patrick Byrne, did a lot of work on this. There's a lot of other people, very smart people, independent people who've looked at this and brought up very serious concerns. But again, it's very hard to find information about it. And I don't feel like I know the truth about this or many other issues because information is so censored and filtered. And that is something that we shouldn't be doing here in America, especially what we see now, which is the United States government telling news agencies and telling journalists what they think is misinformation or not, or what is bad information or good information. Again, that's totally unworkable in a free society.
So, it seems like you have an issue with, social media companies and big tech on this front. So what should the government do then about big tech? If there's a problem with the way that information is getting to the people, does the government have to intervene there?
No, the problem is largely because the government is saying what is true or not. And whenever you have a politician saying what is true or not, that doesn't work well for the people. Misinformation should be allowed, and people need to be able to look at things that are true and things that are lies, and people that are credible and people that are uncredible, and they need to make their own decision. That's how it's always worked, and that's how it should work. The idea that government should tell anybody what is true or not, or especially kind of strong-arm journalists or media or social media by saying this or that is not true, or this should be censored, or that's misinformation, that's really wrong. So as far as social media goes, the government should absolutely be out of that, and they should stop the intervention that they're doing right now.
What about foreign policy? What's your view on the exercise of American power overseas?
We've done a pretty poor job at it over the last 50 years. We've been at war almost constantly. We've bombed countries all over the world, and it's been an absolute dismal failure. And now those same kind of foreign policy failures are being repeated again, and we're doing the same kind of saber rattling and aggressive actions that has failed us so many times. There's so many parallels right now between Ukraine and the Taliban and what happened in Afghanistan. You remember, as Zelensky is a hero now, Osama bin Laden was once considered a hero. There was articles talking about how he was leading his army on a road to peace, and there was a hero in a James Bond movie who was based on bin Laden, and the CIA sent operatives over there, and we trained thousands and thousands of people on how to make bombs and how to shoot RPGs. And those ended up killing Americans. Our foreign policy was an absolute disaster. We were over there for 20 years and we have nothing to show for it. We do this again and again and again. The military-industrial complex keeps getting us into these wars, and we have this sort of never-ending war situation. It's not our place. We should mind our own business and only use our troops, put our troops in harm's way if it's a true threat to the United States Constitution. And that's the oath that I took as when I enlisted, and that's the oath that you take if you are in federal office as well, to protect and defend the Constitution. We should do nothing more than that.
So you don't want America to be the world's policeman. What about the policing debate here in America? What's your perspective on that? What do you think about the defund the police movement?
We should defund the police in many ways, but not in the ways that most of the people who are using that slogan say so. What we should do is have less laws. Eric Garner was killed on a street in New York City because some busybody bureaucrat decided there should be a law against loose cigarettes. And that's what we need to do. We need to look, and by the way, if you look across the board at where you see these horrible acts of police violence, it's typically in places with very large government, state government, local government, and elected officials at the federal level who are in favor of big government. The government you have, the more violence you're going to have. We now have this huge police, militarized police. We have a 300,000 person standing army in the form of the TSA. We have a lot of law enforcement and a lot of laws. We have people in prisons right now that taxpayers are paying $50,000 or $70,000 a year for, who are there because they had a forbidden plant. that just doesn't work, and it doesn't work in this kind of economy. So I support police. I like police. I've had family members who are police. I've worked with police many times. I've done training with police. The best thing we can do for police officers is not force them to risk their life going out enforcing ridiculous laws that have no victim.
All right, Bruce Fenton, thank you for joining us on Close Up. We'll see you out there on the campaign trail.
Thanks so much.